This is the second half of our analysis and look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham Jail. We're going to start on page 6 now and pick up where we left off in the prior video. One of the things I want to note to you here is that if you notice about halfway through or so, halfway through the argument that MLK is making, he actually brings up these particular people to whom he is writing. As you recall, he's writing to 8 white clergymen. You will see he talks about the white moderate and had hoped what they would do, and of course, as he points out a little bit later on, have not done thus far. That's exactly the people that he is talking to, or his main audience, these 8 white clergymen. They are, by definition, moderate individuals, even if they disagree notably with MLK. And he takes a moment here to really talk about them. And a little bit later on, we'll see he'll talk specifically to them, and I'll point that out to you. But I also want to take a moment to show you the logic he uses in this second paragraph. As you recall from earlier, I talked about ethos, pathos, and logos being the 3 parts of an argument. Greeks used to argue this was the case, that ethos being your ethics or your reputation, pathos being your emotion, and logos being your logic that you would use. The 3 parts of these, used in different measures depending upon the kind of argument you're making, is what makes for a good argument. If you look at the second paragraph here that begins, in your statement you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act of the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never-ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? And as he basically points out from there, as he says later on, you punish the robber, not the robbed. It's this nice flip of don't blame people because violence happens. Blame the people who are perpetrating the violence, not the people who are on the receiving end of it, as he argues, of course, that he and those working with him have been. A little further down, I want to show you a couple things happening on page 7 that are rather notable. Pardon me. You will see, first of all, right here, this paragraph that actually began on 6. He's talking about this notion of being extreme. He's been called an extremist before, which he'll acknowledge even more in just a moment. But he cites a group that he feels like is extreme. I just want to take a second to point out. The largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. Quick side note, Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam at the time, and Malcolm X is his most notable protege, and someone who historically I think we're all aware of. Many people see Malcolm X as being on kind of one side of the argument, and MLK being on another in terms of what is acceptable activity. One of the most infamous quotes you'll see about Malcolm X is "by any means necessary." Although I will note to you real quickly that Malcolm X himself, after he got out of prison and became a leader in the Nation of Islam, never perpetrated any sort of violence of note at all. So you will point out that they're on one side. He sees on one side, and on the other side, Martin Luther King Jr. sort of sees himself. Of course, I will point out there actually is a third side, and that was the complacent side, those who were not doing anything. And both of those groups, the Nation of Islam, and of course those following Martin Luther King Jr. would, I think, agree that the complacent were the ones that were the most problematic and troubling. But if you look a little further down here, I want to point out, as he continues to discuss what this notion is, towards the bottom we get this, but though I was initially disappointed in being categorized an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. What you see here, of course, is that MLK is again using logic, but is also playing around with definitions of words. Now, I'm not to suggest he's misdefining anything, but we are defining things differently now, to take what people have said and to apply it to you appropriately. And in this case, as MLK points out, at first he feels like this is not a good title to have, an extremist. But then again, when you start thinking about who we continue to be consider to be extreme, it's not such a bad group to be in after all. He notes, for example, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like the waters. Was not Paul an extremist? I bear in my body the marks of Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther? Here I stand. Was not John Bunyan? I will stay in jail to the end of my days. Abraham Lincoln? This nation cannot survive half slave, half free. Thomas Jefferson? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And as he points out, those are all extreme stances to take. It's not just a bad group to be in. Again, these religious and historical examples, in this case of persons who were absolutely extreme in their words, in many cases in their actions, during the time in which they lived, all of a sudden this notion of being extremist isn't such a bad thing. And as he points out a little bit later on, the question is, what kind of extremist will you be? And to some degree, for whom will you be it? This argument, taking something you have been called and flipping it on its head, can be relatively easy to do, depending upon what it is you're talking about, but really effective as well too. And certainly that's the case with MLK. A little further down, we'll go to the 8th page. I just want to highlight one thing in particular on here that has been, when he gets rather straightforwardly personal to these 8 white clergymen. If you look at this paragraph that begins, the second full paragraph, let me take note of my other major disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. He's talking exactly to these people. But now notice something. When he actually doesn't call them by name, but at least by type, he calls them out. Check out what page we're on. We're on the 8th page of an 11-page document. We're well into this argument. And notice something. Even when he calls them out, he does so in a respectful manner at the same time. Of course, there's some notable exceptions, he says, and he kind of lists those. But despite these exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. This is a good paragraph to highlight this. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who is nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. 2 things he's doing there. Number 1, he's giving his ethos, that is his reputation. He is someone who is of the church, therefore his criticism of the church means something. Secondly, even when he says something negative about them, notice it is, I have been disappointed. It is not casting some dispersion upon them. It's not calling them a name. It still has that controlled argument that attempts to win people over, but still be open and honest with them at the same time. It's a hard thing to do sometimes, but incredibly effective when it can be done. A little further down, he continues to talk about the kind of concerns he has. If you look at this second full paragraph on page 9 here, though, there's another example of ethos that's rather notable. It takes place towards the very end of the piece. Yes, these questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I do otherwise? I am in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ, but oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists. This notion of establishing your reputation, he doesn't do it as much early on. If you notice, it's actually, I think, for good reason. He simply declares himself a fellow clergyman, and into the argument he goes. He doesn't feel the need to sort of support himself past that point. These people know who he is, at least in terms of his title, but he's going to approach them in a manner in which he is a clergyman, not a civil rights leader, as he will say a little bit later on. The other thing I want to point out right there, of course, is he does give us a little bit of background and shows us a little bit about himself. He is deeply tied to the church. And when these 8 white clergymen are the persons he's talking to, he has ties that are just as deep, in some cases perhaps even at least time-wise, deeper in some cases than theirs are. After this 9th page, on the 10th one he starts to talk about a couple of things he wants to take a moment with, to point out, for example, that the police that they have been so warm towards are in fact not terribly been doing a terribly good job at all. In fact, they have been rather violent in their responses to them. I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. Notice that controlled voice is still there. The 11th page is the final page. As he says in these last 3 paragraphs, never before have I written so long a letter. He points out, of course, that when you're in jail, what else can you do? It is a quick reminder to them about where they are, and especially where he is in this argument. He is not exactly sitting in a comfortable situation and setting to be able to make this argument come forth. Notice this second last paragraph. I hope if I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth, that indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. Recall from our last discussion, he wants to answer them in what are patient and reasonable terms because they call him unwise and untimely. Here's that echo again. Unreasonable impatience. Unwise, untimely. It's still there. That echo still continues even to this very last page. He points out, of course, that he hopes to meet them again and that they can meet each other as fellow clergymen. And then he goes out in kind of a poetic way. And I will point out the way he signs this. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. He doesn't give any of his formal titles, doctor, reverend, those kind of things. Just simply his hereditary title, his second to his father in terms of heredity there. But just his name, nothing else. If you read the prior piece by the 8 white clergymen, each of them signed not only their name, but pretty much every title they had, any affiliations they had with particular churches, any degrees they held. He doesn't do any of that. He just comes at them as a clergyman, as a man. As I said to you in the prior video, I found this to be an incredibly striking piece. It's nonfiction, obviously, and a lot of what we read tends to be fiction-based, poetically based, but of course there is a real place for nonfiction in American literature and literature generally as well. So as you consider what makes America America, much of what we think about may be those things those artifacts left behind, fiction, nonfiction, plays, those kind of things. But of course, there's a great place for memoir, for other kind of nonfiction, and especially for just a straightforward argument like MLK makes here. This attempt at a persuasive speech, although written as a letter, very much fits into what you would find in any sort of argument class you ever take, obviously. It's a strong, wonderful piece that I hope you enjoyed, and hope you'll continue to look into Martin Luther King Jr.'s not only his life, but also his writings as well as his speeches. He is and was a persuasive man, one who we find to be a historically notable figure. But please know, I would argue he's an incredibly notable literary figure as well, too.